I know who you really are.
She walked straight toward him in a room full of people, pretending he didn't exist. Every eye in the Ashbourne Grand Ballroom had been carefully, deliberately looking away from the Duke of Carenthal for 3 months. Ever since the scandal broke, ever since they stripped him of his parliamentary seat and dragged his name through every newspaper in England. But Lillian Vale walked toward him, head high, heart hammering, clutching a secret in her chest that could either save him or destroy them both. And when she reached him and said those 7 words, "I know who you really are," something dark and electric woke behind his eyes. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Welcome to Duke Royal Tales, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The ballroom was the kind of room designed to make ordinary people feel small. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from a ceiling painted with clouds and gods. The walls were gilded within an inch of their lives. Every woman present wore jewels that could ransom a small country, and every man wore the particular expression of someone who believed the world had been arranged specifically for their comfort. Lillian Vale felt none of it. She was not ordinary, but she had spent most of her 26 years being treated as though she were. A journalist, a woman, a journalist who was a woman. The combination that London's elite found most threatening and most convenient to dismiss. She worked for the Northern Correspondent, a paper that had somehow survived 3 decades of aristocratic pressure by being too stubborn to fold and too accurate to sue. Tonight, she had come to the Ashbourne Annual Charity Gala as a guest of Lady Henrietta Fairclough, who owed her a favor and had no idea what Lillian intended to do with it. What she intended to do was approach the one man in England no one else would go near. Lord Adrian Vasquez Crane, the Duke of Carenthal, stood near the far window, alone. That was the thing about disgrace in elite society. It happened in public, and then the person continued to exist in public, which was its own particular cruelty. He hadn't fled to the continent like most men in his position. He hadn't retreated to his country estate and disappeared into grouse hunting and self-pity. He had come to the Ashbourne Gala, dressed impeccably in black evening clothes, and he was standing near the window as though he had been invited and was simply choosing not to be sociable. Lillian had come to understand, entirely characteristic of him. She had been studying Adrian Vasquez Crane for 11 weeks. She had read every article written about the scandal, the accusations that he had used his position on the Parliamentary Finance Committee to funnel funds toward his own estates, that he had accepted bribes from 2 railway companies in exchange for favorable legislation, that the signature on the relevant documents was his. She had read all of it, and she had found something that no one else had looked for. She crossed the room. People moved aside for her, not because she was titled or powerful, but because she moved with the particular purposefulness that makes crowds instinctively part. She kept her eyes on him. He was looking out the window, his jaw set, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was aware of every conversation happening around him, and the precise nature of each one. He heard her approach. She was certain of it. He didn't turn until she was 3 feet away, and then he turned slowly, as though already bored by whatever pleasantry was coming. He was taller than she'd expected. Photographs didn't capture the way he occupied space, like gravity worked slightly differently around him, pulling things toward him and simultaneously keeping them at a distance. His eyes were dark, the particular brown of old amber, and they assessed her in a single sweep that missed absolutely nothing. "You're not anyone I know," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm Lillian Vale. I write for the Northern Correspondent." Every remaining trace of idle curiosity left his face. It was replaced by something flat and controlled and very slightly dangerous. "Then you should leave. I know who you really are," she said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. They were 4 of the most loaded seconds Lillian had experienced in her adult life, because she watched something move through his expression, not quite shock, not quite fear, but a controlled, careful, calculating attention that felt like being looked at through a telescope. "What did you say?" His voice was very quiet. "I know who you really are," she repeated, "and I know you didn't sign those documents." He said nothing for a long moment. Around them, the ballroom continued its elaborate performance of wealth and connection. Someone laughed near the champagne table. The orchestra shifted into a waltz. 2 women in pastel gowns glanced toward Lillian and Adrian with the practiced sideways attention of people who wanted to observe without appearing to observe. Adrian took 1 step closer, just one. but it reduced the distance between them to something that stopped being polite. "You have approximately 30 seconds, he said, to explain that statement before I have you removed from this building." "The signature on the Finance Committee documents," Lillian said, keeping her voice steady, "was made with a left-handed pen angle. I have 3 handwriting analysts who will confirm this. You are right-handed. Severely, notably, visibly right-handed. Every photograph of you signing public documents shows this clearly. Someone forged your signature, and they did it carelessly because they didn't think anyone would look. The amber eyes didn't blink. Furthermore," she continued, "the railway bribe transaction was dated the 14th of March. I have confirmed, through 3 independent sources and 1 very cooperative harbor master, that you were in Gibraltar on the 14th of March attending the funeral of your mother's brother. You could not physically have been in London to receive a payment. Still nothing." "Duke Carenthal," she said, because she needed him to understand she was serious. "I'm not here to write about your guilt. I'm here because I think you're being used as a very convenient scapegoat by someone significantly more powerful than you, and I think that person is still operating, and I think that should matter to someone." He studied her for what felt like a very long time. "Why you?" he said finally. "Beg your pardon? Why are you the one who looked? Every journalist in England has covered this story. Why did you look for something different?" Lillian met his gaze. "Because the story everyone was writing was too clean. Scandals this neat always have an architect." He didn't remove her from the building. Instead, he said, quietly and without inflection, "Walk with me," and moved toward the far corridor without waiting to see if she followed. She followed. The corridor beyond the main ballroom was cooler and almost silent, lined with portraits of the Ashbourne family going back 4 generations. Their footsteps were muffled by thick carpet. Adrian walked with his hands still behind his back, that same contained, deliberate posture, but she could see something had changed in the set of his jaw. Less armor, more thought. He stopped in front of a portrait of a woman in Regency dress, her expression serene and slightly bored. "The harbor master," he said. "Which one?" "I won't tell you that until I know you're not going to use that information in a way that puts him at risk." He looked at her then, over his shoulder, and the amber eyes held something she hadn't seen in them before. Not calculation, something more like unwilling respect. "How long have you been working on this?" 11 weeks. "Alone?" "Mostly." "Why haven't you published?" "Because I don't have an architect yet. The evidence I have cleared you. It doesn't name anyone else. A story that says this man is innocent without explaining who is guilty will be dismissed in 48 hours, and I'll never be able to print a follow-up." He turned fully to face her. The corridor light was warm and indirect, and it did something complicated to the planes of his face. He was, she noted with the detached clarity of someone trying very hard not to notice, extremely striking. Not handsome in the easy, obvious way, something more uneven and more interesting than that. "You need access," he said. "Yes." "To me, my records, my correspondence, my history with the Finance Committee. Yes. And in exchange you give me 11 weeks of research that may be the only existing record of your innocence. And a journalist who is very good at her job and has absolutely nothing to lose by printing the truth." He was quiet again. Outside, muffled by walls and distance, the orchestra continued. "You have a great deal of audacity," he said finally, "for someone who walked into a room and introduced herself to the most disgraced man in London. I've found audacity to be fairly efficient." And then, briefly, unexpectedly, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known was there, he almost smiled. 3 days later, Lillian received a card. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, engraved with nothing but an address in Mayfair and a time. No signature, no explanation. She went. The house was large and Georgian and in considerably better repair than she'd expected for a man whose assets were supposedly frozen pending investigation. A butler admitted her without asking her name, which meant she'd been expected, which meant she'd been described, which was a strange and slightly vertiginous realization. She was shown to study. It was the most aggressively inhabited room she had ever been in. Every surface held paper, stacked, folded, annotated, cross-referenced. 3 of the 4 walls were covered in bookshelves that had long since surrendered to the overflow and now also supported rolled maps, bound ledgers, and what appeared to be several years of parliamentary transcripts. A large desk occupied the center of the room, and behind it sat Adrian Vasquez Crane in his shirt-sleeves, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looking not remotely like a duke, and extremely like a man who had not slept properly in 3 months. He looked up when she entered. The glasses came down from his forehead, and off entirely, folded and set aside with the precision of someone who did everything with precision. Misvale, Duke Carenthal, sit down, and don't call me that here. It's a title that is currently more hindrance than help. She sat. What should I call you? He considered this. Adrian will do it. It was such an unexpectedly direct answer that she blinked. He was already pulling a folder from one of the stacks. This is everything I have relating to the Finance Committee from the 18 months preceding my removal, he said. I've marked the relevant sections. You'll see that at no point was I the only person with access to the documents in question. There were 7 other committee members, 2 senior clerks, and at least 1 external consultant whose credentials I have since been unable to verify. An external consultant who can't be verified, Lillian said carefully. Yes. Hired 3 months before my removal on the recommendation of a committee member who resigned his own seat 2 weeks after the scandal broke. He looked at her steadily. He resigned citing ill health. And is he ill? He is currently in Tuscany. The Tuscan climate is apparently very beneficial for men in their 50s who have recently exited several very uncomfortable situations. Lillian set her notebook on the desk. I'm going to need his name. Lord Prescott Hawthorne, second son of the Earl of Merwick, a man who, if you look carefully at his voting record over the past 4 years, has been extremely consistent in supporting legislation favorable to 2 specific railway companies. She wrote the name down. Her hand was steady. Her pulse was not. Adrian, she said, because she had been given permission, and because she needed him to understand this was important. If what you're telling me is accurate, this goes considerably higher than a committee scandal. Yes, he said, without surprise. It does. How high? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That is what I have not been able to determine. And that is why I need someone who can access places I currently cannot. They worked for 6 hours that first day. Lillian had expected him to be difficult, guarded, controlling, reluctant to share anything that made him look vulnerable. Instead, he was methodical and thorough and completely unsentimental about his own disgrace. He laid out documents with the same detached precision she imagined he brought to everything, explaining context without defensiveness, acknowledging gaps in the record without embarrassment. He was also, she discovered, paying very close attention to her. Not in the way she was used to being paid attention to, the cataloging look, the dismissive glance, the particular way men in powerful rooms assessed whether a woman was worth speaking to or simply worth looking at. This was different. He watched her think. She caught him doing it twice, looking up from his own documents to observe her as she read, something in his expression that she couldn't quite name. When she caught him the second time, he didn't look away. You're annotating in the margins, he said. Is that a problem? Those are my documents. I'll copy my notes to separate paper before I leave. I annotate when I read. It helps me see what's missing. He looked at what she'd written in pencil, very lightly, in the margin of a parliamentary transcript, a single question mark beside a date. Then he sat back in his chair, and there was that almost smile again. The date, he said. That's when you realize the timeline doesn't hold. The 13th of February, she confirmed. This document is dated the 13th. The transaction was dated the 14th. Someone moved the paper sequence backward by 1 day. A small error. Small enough that it went unnoticed for 3 months. Until now, she said. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, she had a secondary notebook entirely full of connections and questions and threads that needed pulling. By the end of the second week, she had started staying past 6 o'clock, and someone, she suspected the butler, or possibly Adrian himself, had begun leaving tea on the corner of the desk at 5:30 without being asked. The study felt less chaotic now, though she couldn't have said exactly why. The stacks of paper were in the same positions. The shelves were no different. She thought perhaps it was that she had stopped being disoriented by the volume of information and started being able to navigate it. Or perhaps it was that she had stopped feeling like a stranger in the room. On the 10th day, she arrived to find Adrian not at the desk but standing at the window with his back to the door, one hand braced against the frame, looking out at the street below. He didn't turn when she entered. There are men outside, he said. She crossed to the second window and looked. 2 men standing on the opposite pavement with the slightly too still quality of people trying to appear idle. How long? She asked. Since this morning. They were there when I came downstairs at 7 and they're still there now. Do you recognize either of them? No. He turned from the window. He looked, she noticed, tired in a way that went beyond not sleeping. the particular exhaustion of someone who had been managing a threat for long enough that it had settled into their bones. This is what I expected would happen eventually. Someone has noticed that I haven't simply accepted the situation, or someone has noticed you've had a visitor every day for 2 weeks. His eyes came to her face. I should have thought of that, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite an apology but was in the vicinity. We should assume they already know who I am, she said practically, which means we need to think about what they'll do with that information. She sat down at the desk and opened her notebook. Do you trust your butler? Completely. And the rest of the household? The housekeeper and the cook have been with my family for 20 years. The 2 footmen were hired by the housekeeper personally. I would stake my life on all 4 of them. You may be doing exactly that, she said, without drama. He sat down across from her and the amber eyes were very direct and very steady. Miss Vale, he said. Lillian. She looked up. If you need to stop, he said. If this has become dangerous in a way you didn't agree to, I will understand. I don't require you to continue. She looked at him for a moment. The controlled composure that she had come to understand was not coldness but rather the careful management of feelings that ran very deep. At the exhaustion underneath, at the way he had said her name, not as a familiarity but as something more deliberate than that. I'm not stopping, she said. You should consider Adrian, she said it firmly. I'm not stopping. Something shifted in his expression. The kind of shift that happens when someone who has been holding everything at arm's length for a very long time is surprised by warmth. He looked back at his documents. Very well, he said quietly. That evening, as she was preparing to leave, she heard voices in the entrance hall. Sharp, elevated, the specific register of a conversation that wanted to be an argument and was being kept just barely below that threshold. She came to the top of the stairs and looked down. Adrian stood in the entrance hall, and opposite him was a man she recognized from newspaper photographs. Lord Prescott Hawthorne. He was shorter than she'd imagined, compact and well-dressed, with the ruddy complexion of a man who spent time outdoors and the eyes of a man who spent time calculating. Cannot continue to behave as though this will simply resolve itself, Hawthorne was saying, his voice low and clipped. The committee has made its position clear. The investigation, Adrian said, and his voice was perfectly level, is predicated on documents I did not sign. You and I both know this. A pause. That is a very serious accusation, Hawthorne said. It is a very serious crime, Adrian replied. Lillian, at the top of the stairs, did not breathe. Hawthorne's eyes moved upward. He looked directly at her. She met his gaze without moving, without flinching. She had been seen. There was no recovering from that, no pretending she hadn't heard. She held eye contact for exactly long enough to make clear she had heard everything, and then she descended the stairs at a perfectly composed pace, and said, Good evening, to Hawthorne with the pleasantness of someone who has no idea she is doing anything unusual. Hawthorne looked at Adrian. Adrian looked back, and if she could read anything in his expression, and she was beginning to be able to read him, it was the tight, controlled alertness of a man recalculating very rapidly. Miss Vale is assisting me with some estate correspondence, Adrian said. At this hour, Hawthorne said. I keep unconventional hours, Lillian said pleasantly. Hawthorne said nothing else. He left. The butler closed the door behind him with pointed care, and then it was just the 2 of them in the entrance hall, and the silence had a particular quality. He knows, she said. Yes, Adrian agreed. That changes our timeline. Considerably. He looked at her, and there was something in the amber eyes that was new. Not quite fear, not quite possessiveness, something between the 2. How close are you to having enough? A week, she said. Maybe less, if the harbor master confirms what I think he'll confirm. What do you need from me? She thought about the file she'd been building, the timeline discrepancies, the signature analysis, the name of an external consultant who didn't exist in any official record, the travel documents that placed Adrian 3 countries away when the bribe was supposedly received. I need you to be somewhere very visible and very documented tomorrow, she said. Somewhere public where your presence is recorded. If something happens to me in the next week, if anything happens to me, I need it to be impossible for anyone to suggest you were involved. He looked at her for a long time. Nothing, he said very quietly, is going to happen to you. Adrian, I will be visible tomorrow, he said, in the tone that meant the conversation was over on this particular point. But nothing is going to happen to you. She went home through streets that felt slightly altered. Not unsafe, but observed the way the air feels before weather changes. Her apartment was small and organized in a way that functioned as armor against chaos. She had lived there for 4 years, since the Northern correspondent had brought her to London from Leeds, and she had filled it with books and notes, and the accumulated evidence of every story she had ever told. It smelled of ink and tea and the coffee she made in the mornings when she was working out a problem. She sat at her desk and opened her notebook. She had more than she'd told him. She had the name of the external consultant, a real person, it turned out, but one who had died 18 months ago, whose identity had been borrowed for the committee paperwork. A dead man's credentials used to authorize access to documents that a living man had then forged. She had a banking record, not complete, not yet, but a partial trail showing a transfer from an account she couldn't yet name to an account she very nearly could. She had, most damningly, a letter. It had come to her through an intermediary who had asked to remain anonymous, delivered in a plain envelope to the newspaper's offices 3 days ago. It was a letter from one committee member to another, discussing the situation with the Finance Committee documents in terms that were just ambiguous enough to survive a lawyer's reading, but just specific enough that anyone paying attention would understand exactly what was being discussed. The letter was signed with initials. P.H. She had not told Adrian about the letter. She needed to understand why someone had sent it to her before she showed it to him. Information that arrived unsolicited, in a situation like this, was either a gift or a trap, and she had not yet determined which. She stayed up until 2 in the morning, turning this over. When she finally went to bed, she dreamed of amber eyes watching her from across a candle-lit room, careful and intent, seeing something she hadn't known was visible. The morning brought confirmation. The harbor master in Gibraltar, a man named Vasquez who had worked the port for 31 years and had the unimpressed manner of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing, had agreed to put his account in writing. He had seen Adrian Vasquez Crane on the 14th of March. He had spoken to him. He had records of the Carenthal private vessel in the harbor on that date and the 4 days preceding it. Lillian held the document and felt the particular satisfaction of a piece fitting into a space that had been waiting for it. She was 2 blocks from Adrian's house when the man stepped in front of her. He was large and deliberately positioned, and the 2 men behind him were equally deliberate. This was not accidental. She assessed this in approximately 1 second. "Miss Vale," the large man said. He had the flat effect of someone doing a job. "We'd like a word." "I don't know you," she said, keeping her voice level. "Lord Hawthorne would like to discuss your current project. Lord Hawthorne," she said, "can make an appointment with my editor. Lord Hawthorne would prefer a more private conversation." She was on a public street. It was 9:30 in the morning. There were other people on the pavement. Not many, but some. She made a rapid calculation about the variables. She said, clearly and at a volume calibrated for the nearest pedestrian to hear, "I am Lillian Vale of the Northern Correspondent, and these men are attempting to prevent me from walking down a public street." The nearest pedestrian was a woman in her 40s with a shopping basket who looked up sharply. The man in front of Lillian flinched, barely perceptibly. "That's not," he began. "I have documentation of my current project secured in 3 separate locations," Lillian said, still at a useful volume. "If I don't arrive at my destination in the next 15 minutes, my editor has instructions." The 3 men looked at each other. She walked through them. Her heart was hammering so forcefully she could feel it in her teeth, but she walked at a steady pace and did not look back, and she turned the corner toward Adrian's house, and she made herself keep breathing. The butler opened the door before she knocked. He had seen her coming then. She stepped inside, and he closed the door, and she stood in the entrance hall and allowed herself 30 seconds to feel everything she had not allowed herself to feel on the street. "Miss Vale," Adrian's voice from the doorway of the study. "What happened?" She looked at him. He was very still in the way he got when he was managing something intense. "Hawthorne sent people," she said. 3 of them, on Darley Street." The stillness became something different, something with an edge. "Are you hurt?" "No, I managed them, but Adrian—" She crossed the hall, lowering her voice. "He knows what I have, or he suspects. This is escalating faster than I expected." He stepped back to let her into the study and closed the door. The room felt different suddenly, smaller, more pressurized. "Show me," he said. She laid it all out on the desk. The harbor master's document, the banking partial, the timeline analysis, the handwriting reports, and then, last, the letter. He picked up the letter. "Read it. Read it again." "When did you receive this?" he said. 3 days ago." He looked up. The amber eyes were very serious. You didn't tell me. I needed to determine if it was a gift or a trap. And I think it's both, she said. I think someone in Hawthorne's circle is afraid of what's coming and is trying to position themselves on the right side before it arrives. They sent this to me specifically, not to the paper's general address. To me, by name. Which means they know I'm working on this, and they're betting that I'm the safest person to give it to. Because I can't use it, he said slowly. Because anything I produce in my own defense will be characterized as self-serving. But if a journalist publishes it, then it's news, not defense. She nodded. Someone understands the mechanics of this very well. He set the letter down on the desk, precisely, squaring it against the edge. Lillian, he said. She had never heard her name sound quite like that before. This is enough, he said. What you have here. The harbor master's testimony, the handwriting analysis, the timeline discrepancy, this letter. This is enough to print. It's enough to clear you, she said carefully. I told you at the beginning that I needed enough to name someone else. And if that takes another week, and Hawthorne decides to stop sending intermediaries and take more direct action. His voice was still controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. You are not a collateral consideration to me. If something happened to you, I'm a journalist, she said. Risk is, don't. The word came out with a force he then very visibly reined in. He looked away from her, jaw tight, one hand flat on the desk. When he looked back, he had composed himself, but only partially. I am aware of your profession and its requirements. I am asking you to consider whether naming Hawthorne publicly, with what we currently have, is sufficient. Whether forcing this into the open now, before he can take further action, might be the more strategic choice. He'll deny it. Of course he will. He has powerful friends who will support the denial. Yes, the story could be buried. It could. He met her eyes. Or it could be the kind of story that cannot be buried once it exists in print. I have read your work, Lillian. I have been reading it for 11 weeks. You know how to write a story that cannot be ignored. She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. He had read her work for 11 weeks before she had ever walked toward him in that ballroom. You knew who I was, she said, at the gala, when I introduced myself. A brief pause. Yes, you already knew what I was doing. I had heard, through contact, that a journalist at the Northern Correspondent was asking questions about my timeline. His voice was careful. I didn't know what you would find, but you let me approach you. I was curious, he said. What you would say, whether the questions you were asking would lead you where I suspected they led. She looked at him steadily. You could have come to me. A disgraced duke seeking out a journalist would have looked exactly like what Hawthorne's people would want it to look like. You coming to me, he paused. You coming to me looked like something else. What did it look like? He was quiet for a moment. The amber eyes were entirely direct. Like someone who had found the truth, he said quietly, and decided to do something about it. She wrote for 17 hours. She went home, locked her door, put every piece of evidence on the dining room table in order, and she wrote. She wrote the story the way she always wrote stories that mattered, from the ground up, fact by fact, with every claim supported and every connection explained, with the restraint that made accusations into evidence and evidence into truth. She was named Hawthorne. She did it carefully, thoroughly, with the harbor master's testimony and the handwriting analysis and the timeline and the letter and the partial banking record and the dead consultant's borrowed identity, all assembled into a structure that was airtight and devastatingly clear. She submitted it to her editor at 4 a.m. with a message that said, only. This is ready. Run it tomorrow. Her editor, a man named Cartwright, who had been in journalism for 40 years and had the unshakable calm of someone who had survived every possible crisis, read it and responded at 5:15. It runs at noon. The next morning, a Sunday, she was at Adrian's house by 9. She didn't tell him the story was running. She told him it was almost ready. She wasn't sure why she withheld it, perhaps because she needed one more morning in that study, with the stacks of paper and the tea that appeared at 5:30, before everything changed. They worked. He was quieter than usual, and she caught him watching her more than once. Just after 11, he set down his pen. You've already submitted it, he said. She looked up. Haven't you, he said. Yes. There was no point in pretending otherwise. When does it run? An hour. He was very still. You should have told me. I know. Why didn't you? She thought about this. About the honest answer, which was more complicated than she'd expected to find. Because once it runs, she said finally, everything changes. For you, obviously, but also, she stopped. Also, he said, also for this. She gestured, a little helplessly, at the room, the papers, the accumulated weeks of working side by side. This particular situation ends. You no longer need my research, and I no longer have a reason to be here, and I suppose I wasn't ready for that to happen yet. The silence that followed was the longest and most charged of all the silences she had spent in this room, and she had spent many. Adrian rose from his chair and crossed to where she was sitting, and he stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him from her seat, and the amber eyes were doing something she had no adequate word for. "You have a reason to be here," he said. "That has nothing to do with research." She didn't move. "Adrian, you walked toward me," he said, "in a room where every other person was making a careful study of the floor. That took a particular kind of courage, or conviction. I wasn't sure which, at first. And now? Now I've spent 2 weeks watching you work," he said. "Watching you read and annotate and connect and argue and refuse to be frightened when frightening things happen. I've watched you treat the truth as something worth protecting at personal cost, which is rarer than it should be. And I find that He stopped, recalibrated, continued. "I find that the situation ending is not something I'm prepared for either." Her heart was doing something deeply inconvenient. "You're the subject of my story," she said. "I'm aware. That's a significant professional complication." "Yes." He didn't move away. "Is it an insurmountable one?" She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had stood alone near a window in a room full of people pretending he didn't exist, and had been quietly building his own case with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. At the man who had read her work for 11 weeks before she ever introduced herself. At the man who had told her, very quietly, that nothing was going to happen to her, and who had clearly meant it. "Ask me again," she said, "in about an hour, when the story has run and the landscape has changed." He understood the precision of that. She could see it in the slight easing of his expression. "In an hour," he agreed. The story ran at noon. By past, it was the most read article in the Northern Correspondent's digital history. By 1, 3 other papers had picked it up. By 2, Hawthorne's office had released a denial that was so carefully worded it essentially confirmed everything. By 3, 2 members of Parliament had called for an independent review of the Finance Committee investigation. Lillian sat on the sofa in Adrian's drawing room. She had been moved from the study at some point. She wasn't sure exactly when. With her phone in one hand and a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink in the other, watching the world reorganize itself. Adrian sat beside her. Not at an appropriate social distance, beside her. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the solid steadiness. "Your editor is calling," he observed, looking at her phone. "He can leave a message," she said. He almost smiled. 2 committee members called for a review. The denial from Hawthorne's office is already being dissected on 3 major platforms. "The denial was a mistake," she said, "too specific in the places where it should have been general. His lawyers should have kept him quiet. He panicked. Yes, powerful men who have never faced real accountability panic beautifully." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You knew the denial would be that specific." She glanced at him. "I wrote the story to make a specific denial impossible without confirming the evidence. It's a technique." The amber eyes were doing the thing she had no word for again. "It's been an hour," he said. She held very still. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Tonight. Somewhere that is not this study. Somewhere where I am not your research subject, and you are not my investigator, and we are simply 2 people having dinner. If that is something you would consider." She thought about the professional complications. She thought about the landscape that had just been reorganized by the story she'd written. She thought about amber eyes watching her think, and a name said like something deliberate, "And nothing is going to happen to you." "Yes," she said. "Yes. Don't look so surprised," she told him. "You've been extremely easy to say yes to lately." This time he actually smiled. It transformed his face entirely, as she'd suspected it would, opening up something that had been carefully managed for much too long. "I'll remember that," he said. 3 months later, the independent review concluded. Lord Prescott Hawthorne resigned his parliamentary seat and was referred for criminal investigation. The external consultant's borrowed identity was formally linked to a specific individual within his office. The banking trail, completed by investigators with access that Lillian hadn't had, led directly to an account in his wife's name. The Finance Committee proceedings against Adrian Vasquez Crane were formally withdrawn. A brief statement from the Duke of Carenthal's office noted that he was grateful for the thorough work of independent investigators, and the Free Press made specific reference to the Northern Correspondent, and indicated that he looked forward to resuming his parliamentary duties at the earliest opportunity. Lillian read the statement at her desk. She was still at the Northern Correspondent. She would always be at the Northern Correspondent, or somewhere very like it. That was not something she had any intention of changing. Her phone lit up. One message. Dinner. Tonight. And this time I'm choosing the restaurant. She typed back. You chose last week. His response was immediate. And you said it was the best meal you'd ever had. She had, in fact, said that. She'd also said considerably more in the weeks that had passed, in private, in rooms considerably more intimate than a study stacked with parliamentary transcripts. She had said things she'd thought herself incapable of saying to a man she had walked toward in a ballroom because she was very good at recognizing the truth when she saw it. Fine, she wrote back, but I'm annotating the menu. 3 dots appeared. Then. I wouldn't expect anything less. At a club in Mayfair, 3 months after the scandal broke, and 3 months before it would fully resolve, a man named Hawthorne sat very still in a leather chair and thought about a woman who had walked toward a disgraced duke in a ballroom full of people looking the other way. He thought about the 7 words she had said. He thought about the story that had followed. He thought about the fact that the harbor master in Gibraltar, a man who had worked the port for 31 years, had not actually been Lillian Vale's source. He thought about the letter sent to her in a plain envelope, the letter with his initials, the letter he had never written. He sat with that for a very long time, because someone had written that letter. Someone had fabricated evidence that corroborated everything else Lillian Vale had found. Someone had made sure the story ran clean and unassailable, with documentation that pointed directly at him. Someone had been several steps ahead of everyone. He looked out the window of the club at the London street, and he thought about the Duke of Carenthal, a man who had spent months appearing to simply endure disgrace with stoic composure, and he wondered, for the first time, whether the 11 weeks of investigation had been Lillian Vale's project, or whether it had been Adrian Vasquez Crane's, or whether the woman who had walked toward a disgraced duke and said, "I know who you really are," had been telling the truth about something much larger than either of them had yet revealed. Somewhere across London, in a restaurant Adrian had chosen, and Lillian was annotating the menu of, a conversation was happening that contained laughter, and the particular quality of 2 people who were building something real in the aftermath of something hard. Whatever the truth of what had come before, and there was more truth to come, Hawthorne was now certain of that. The 2 of them, at least, appeared to have found it. Some truths, after all, don't need to be published. Some truths only need to be known by the people in the room. And that, besties, is the full story of Lillian Vale and Adrian Vasquez Crane. The woman bold enough to walk toward a disgraced duke, and the man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone brave enough to see him clearly. If this story kept you hooked from the first word to the last, if you felt every charged silence, every almost smile, every moment where the truth was closer than anyone realized, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Please like this video. It tells us you want more stories like this one. Subscribe, so you never miss a new Duke Royal tale dropping on this channel. Comment below, we want to know. Did you catch the moment Hawthorne realized the letter was forged? Who do you think really sent it? And what do you think Lillian and Adrian are hiding? Drop your theories. We read every single one. Share this story with someone who loves royal romance, royal scandal, and heroines who walk straight toward the thing everyone else is running from. More dukes, more secrets, more stories that keep you up past midnight. We'll see you in the next one, besties. Duke Royal Tales.